Welcome to my finance channel. Imagine a silence so profound that it deafens the entire world. It was March 14th, 2026, when the global artery of oil trade suddenly registered an unprecedented number. Zero. Zero ships passed through. On the surface, the water lay eerily still, yet beneath this calm, the nerves of the entire planet were snapping like overstretched guitar strings. This was not merely a temporary blockade in a remote corner of the earth. It was the absolute stoppage of the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow choke point barely over 30 kilometers wide. We long lived in a collective delusion regarding global stability. We stubbornly believed the gears of modern industrial civilization would turn forever, and the blood of trade would eternally flow. However, this exquisitely complex global network is actually frighteningly fragile. When that curved waterway fell into dead silence, all arrogance and ignorance were scorched to ashes by the sun, exposing the fraying thread hidden beneath our prosperity. Bridgewater founder Ray Dalio called this the ultimate showdown, even likening it to an American Suez Canal moment. The death knell of the old order has rung. You might ask yourself, how can a narrow waterway barely 30 kilometers wide control the fate of the entire global economy? The answer lies not in the geography itself, but in humanity's endless dependency and deepest fears. This is never just a physical channel. It is the valve of civilization, the pacemaker of our industrial machine. Control this water. Control modernity's right to breathe. During this turbulent dawn, traders on Wall Street screamed in panic, while desperate coups formed at distant gas stations. 20% of the global oil supply was reduced to zero overnight, forcing us to confront a cruel philosophical truth. What we call order is essentially a highly unstable temporary arrangement. Our trust in stability is often built upon a complete ignorance of underlying risks. When the tides of Hormuz stopped pushing the rhythms of trade, the very foundations of the petrodollar system began displaying shocking cracks. This was not just a scarcity of energy, but a total collapse of trust. We are now entering a dark and uncharted era, where the essence of power shrinks from vast territories into that narrow bottleneck. A new iron curtain slowly descends. The grand illusion of globalization completely collapsed the moment that narrow waterway fell into absolute silence. To truly comprehend the fragility of our existence, we must stare directly at the physical dimensions of our dependency. The Strait of Hormuz is not a vast ocean, but a claustrophobic bottleneck shaped like a trumpet. At its narrowest point, it measures a mere 33 kilometers across. How can we entrust the survival of billions to such a microscopic geographic anomaly? On a clear day, one can stand on the Iranian coastline and see the stone structures of Oman with the naked eye. Yet, through this narrow keyhole, 20 million barrels of crude oil must squeeze every single day. This equates to 1/5 of the entire global energy supply. We have essentially placed the beating heart of civilization outside its protective ribcage. The water here is deceivingly shallow, averaging barely 25 meters in depth. For the massive supertankers that transport our vital energy, this is not an ocean. It is a treacherous shoal. The actual navigable channels suffer from severe spatial constraints, leaving only a 2 or 3 kilometer wide suture for these mechanical leviathans to pass. One misstep means absolute paralysis. This vulnerability is not a modern accident. It is a historical trap. Centuries ago, this region whispered the name Ahura Mazda, the Zoroastrian god of light and wisdom. It was once a luminous nexus where empires clashed over silks and spices. But in that era, a blockade only meant a shortage of luxury. Today, it means total civilizational asphyxiation. The Portuguese arrived like ghosts in 1507, wielding cannons to force the native kingdom onto its knees. They understood a dark psychological truth. You do not need to conquer a continent if you can barricade its only exit. This narrow suture transformed from a bustling regional market into the ultimate frontline of global geopolitical blackmail. The strongest empires always seek the smallest choke points. The fatal mutation of human destiny occurred in 1908 when British explorers struck oil in Persia. Instantly, the strategic value of Hormuz underwent a terrifying nuclear fusion. It ceased to be a corridor for ivory and Arabian horses. It mutated into the intravenous tube feeding the factories, airplanes, and power grids of a hyperactive modern world. We traded our independence for convenience. This geographic reality creates the ultimate asymmetrical nightmare. A coastal nation does not need aircraft carriers to cripple the world. They only require a handful of speedboats, a scattering of sea mines, or a single anti-ship missile hidden in the coastal mountains. The illusion of superpower dominance shatters when a simple squeeze on the jugular vein can bring the global giant to its knees. Fourth chapter reflection. We built an empire of steel and glass only to anchor its survival to a 33-kilometer thread. How did humanity willingly bind its entire future to a single fiat currency? To comprehend the fragility of our present moment, we must unravel the grand design of the past. By August 1971, the United States dollar severed its historic anchor to physical gold. The entire world was instantly adrift, forced to rely on a piece of green paper supported by nothing but collective belief and fragile institutional credit. When a currency loses its physical weight, deep psychological fear inevitably takes root. By 1973, a massive oil crisis quadrupled the cost of energy in mere months. The masters of the desert realized a terrifying truth. They held the genuine lifeblood of civilization, while the West held only depreciating paper. The entire global financial order stared directly into the abyss of absolute collapse. In July 1974, facing existential economic ruin, the American empire dispatched its Treasury Secretary, William Simon, to the deserts of Saudi Arabia. He did not arrive offering crates of gold or tangible goods. Instead, he offered a Faustian bargain built entirely on human vulnerability. He ruthlessly targeted their deepest geopolitical fears, promising the absolute protection of the American military umbrella in a highly volatile region. The terms of this silent financial pact were ruthlessly simple and brilliantly effective. In exchange for guaranteed military survival, Saudi Arabia agreed to price its immense oil wealth exclusively in United States dollars. Furthermore, they consented to quietly funnel those massive profits directly back into United States Treasury bonds. For 41 years, the exact scale of this massive wealth transfer remained a strictly guarded state secret. Why would sovereign nations willingly surrender control over their ultimate asset? Because human nature craves safety above all else. The global herd flocked to this system because it projected an aura of invincibility. Every nation on earth now needed dollars simply to keep their factories running and their citizens fed. We constructed a Tower of Babel out of sovereign debt, black oil, and unquestioning compliance. This petrodollar paradigm created an unprecedented financial loop. The rest of the world labored to produce real goods, traded them for paper dollars, used those dollars to buy energy, and sent the profits back to Washington. It was a flawless mechanism of control disguised as free trade. The Strait of Hormuz became the physical valve through which this invisible financial architecture constantly breathed. But every complex system based on human trust harbors a fatal flaw. It relies on the assumption that the architect will always act as a benevolent protector. What happens when the guarantor of security begins to wield the system as a weapon? The illusion of a neutral, global currency begins to fracture the moment nations realize their essential lifeline is actually a choking leash. Chapter Reflection. The greatest financial empire was not built on mountains of gold, but on the silent intertwining of debt, energy, and human fear. Chapter 4. The Fracturing of Trust and the Silent Stampede. Trust is the invisible architecture holding our fractured world together, yet this architecture is terrifyingly brittle. What happens when the supreme caretaker of a global financial system decides to weaponize it against its own participants? We blindly believed that the international monetary network was a neutral global utility, like water or electricity. However, this comforting illusion was violently shattered, exposing the cold reality of absolute control. The Great Awakening began in the early months of 2022, far from the sands of the Middle East. In a matter of days, Western powers deployed an unprecedented financial nuclear weapon, completely freezing approximately $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves. Simultaneously, they expelled major institutions from the SWIFT global messaging system, essentially silencing their ability to conduct normal human commerce. This sudden weaponization sent a paralyzing shockwave through the psyche of every sovereign leader. The masters of Saudi Arabia, India, and Brazil secretly asked themselves a terrifying question. If I displease Washington tomorrow, will my nation's life savings disappear overnight? The illusion of safety evaporated, replaced by the primal fear of confiscation. They realized that digital dollars in foreign vaults were not wealth. They were mere conditional promises. Driven by the primal instinct for self-preservation, the global herd began to stampede toward tangible reality. Central banks around the planet stopped trusting digital illusions and turned back to the ancient anchor of humanity. In 2022 alone, they purchased a staggering 1,136 tons of physical gold, setting the highest record since 1950. They were quietly preparing for the coming storm. Simultaneously, desperate nations began engineering escape routes from the dollar panopticon. The world witnessed the rapid acceleration of alternative payment structures, such as the Inbridge project, designed to settle cross-border trades using central bank digital currencies. By bypassing the traditional Western clearing houses, countries like Saudi Arabia began to reclaim their financial autonomy. The hegemonic tower was not falling. People were simply taking the stairs to leave. This deep financial rebellion eventually merged with the physical blockade in March 2026. When the Strait of Hormuz fell silent, it stopped being merely a geographic or military crisis. It mutated into a global monetary experiment. Reports surfaced that Iran implemented a shadow toll system demanding that desperate shippers pay for passage, using alternative assets, specifically requiring trade settlements in Chinese yuan. The original unspoken promise of the 1970s, where infinite loyalty was exchanged for absolute military protection, had finally rotted away. How can a dependent nation continue to trust an architect who uses the exits as a guillotine? The Strait of Hormuz proved that once the flow of energy detaches from the hegemonic currency, the entire global hierarchy instantly disintegrates into absolute chaos. Paul's fuck. Chapter Reflection. When the guardian of the system uses trust as a weapon, the slaves will inevitably begin forging their own keys. Chapter 5. The Reality of the Grocer's Ezel. We often live under the comforting delusion that geopolitical tremors remain confined to distant oceans. When we hear about naval blockades and frozen shipping lanes, our cognitive bias tells us we are safely insulated in our suburban homes. But the modern world possesses no true borders. The silence of the Strait of Hormuz is not a distant military event. It is a direct assault on your daily existence. Energy is not merely the fuel in your gas tank. It is the invisible blood circulating through every physical object you touch. That black liquid shapes the plastic in your phone and forms the fundamental chemical basis for the fertilizers growing your food. When the valve in the Middle East slams shut, the modern grocery store instantly transforms into a theater of absolute scarcity and mounting panic. Consider the terrifying reality faced by nations lacking their own energy resources. Japan, reliant on the Middle East for 90% of its crude oil, watched in horror as its economic lifeblood evaporated. Their stock markets plummeted, and the government frantically released strategic reserves. In South Korea, desperate authorities instituted emergency price caps as financial markets triggered automatic circuit breakers in a futile attempt to halt the bleeding. Even within the United States, a supposedly self-sufficient superpower, the illusion of immunity quickly shattered. The average price of gasoline violently surged from $3 to over $4, with some regions breaking past $6. This was not a mere inconvenience at the pump. It was a massive invisible tax levied upon the working class, systematically draining the wealth of ordinary citizens who had absolutely no say in the conflict. When energy prices skyrocket, a devastating domino effect ripples through the entire macroeconomic structure. Rampant inflation becomes a wild beast that central banks attempt to tame using the blunt instrument of interest rates. To prevent the complete devaluation of their fiat currency, the Federal Reserve is forced to keep borrowing costs punishingly high. The distant geopolitical war instantly mutates into a localized war against your personal financial stability. Because a narrow strait 10,000 miles away was blockaded, your dream of home ownership evaporates. High interest rates mean your mortgage payments become mathematically impossible, your car loans become suffocating, and your credit card debt spirals into a bottomless abyss. The complex architecture of global finance ensures that when empires clash over a choke point, it is the ordinary individual who absorbs the agonizing shock of the collision. For half a century, the petrodollar system provided an invisible shield, acting as a giant sponge that absorbed the inflation of endlessly printed currency. By exporting dollars for oil, the creators of the currency exported their economic consequences. But as the ship's hull and truss fractures, that massive sponge rapidly shrinks. The printed paper remains trapped domestically, chasing dwindling goods and triggering a structural collapse of your purchasing power. We are profoundly disconnected from the true mechanisms of our survival. We tap a piece of glass to order a package entirely blind to the precarious, sun-scorched maritime highways that make such modern magic possible. The ultimate tragedy of our herd behavior is that we only recognize the invisible strings attaching us to the global machine when those strings are violently pulled, dragging us into an economic abyss. Chapter Reflection: The greatest cruelty of globalization is that a distant empire's geopolitical gamble is always paid for with the bread of the common citizen. Chapter 6: The dawn of a fractured era. How does an empire truly fall? It rarely collapses from a single external blow. Instead, it slowly crumbles beneath the weight of its own contradictions. The petrodollar paradigm rested on one absolute assumption, that the entire human race would forever require black oil to survive. But what happens when that fundamental requirement begins to dissolve? We are witnessing the quiet emergence of a radically new world order. The global transition toward renewable energy is often sold as an environmental crusade, but its deepest truth is pure geopolitics. Every solar panel installed and every wind turbine erected represents a declaration of sovereign independence. When a nation learns to harvest power directly from its own sun and wind, it systematically severs the invisible chains tying it to the distant deserts of the Middle East. This green revolution strikes a fatal blow to the heart of the fiat system. If a country no longer needs to import massive quantities of foreign oil, it automatically no longer needs to hoard massive reserves of United States dollars. The artificial global demand for the hegemonic currency simply evaporates. A world becoming energy self-sufficient is a world that organically escapes the confines of financial serfdom. Simultaneously, the guardian of the old order is suffocating under its own unimaginable excess. The national debt of the United States has dangerously surpassed $39 trillion. We have reached a terrifying mathematical tipping point. In the year 2024, the federal government spent more money merely servicing the interest on its past debt than it spent on its entire defense budget. This represents a lethal, self-inflicted wound upon the global hegemon. How can an empire project ultimate military security when it must borrow endlessly just to pay for its own past mistakes? The world is watching a superpower consume itself from the inside out. The traditional buyers of this sovereign debt are quietly stepping away, leaving the empire to cannibalize its own domestic financial markets for survival. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz is therefore not an isolated tragedy, but the ultimate catalyst accelerating a transformation that was already underway. The old world was defined by monopolized energy and a weaponized currency. The emerging dawn will be defined by decentralized power, fractured trust, and multiple centers of gravity. We are navigating through the most dangerous transition phase in modern human history. Fruit Chapter Reflection. The greatest threat to a financial empire is not a foreign army, but a world that simply learns to survive without it. Chapter 7. The Final Illusion and the Great Reset. The Strait of Hormuz will never return to its former illusion of peace. It now stands as a stark microcosm of our turbulent era, reminding us how frighteningly fragile the geographic foundation of our global prosperity truly is. We have constructed a towering technological civilization, yet we allowed its ultimate survival to hang by a single precarious thread of salt water. As ordinary individuals navigating this era, we are merely fish in a global pond, entirely unable to escape the devastating ripple effects of these geopolitical collisions. Whenever we fill our gas tanks or receive a package delivered from afar, we unknowingly participate in a vast system whose lethal vulnerabilities are purposefully hidden from our view. We desire comfort, willfully ignoring the abyss. The petrodollar architecture that sustained global trust for half a century is demonstrating irreversible cracks. We are currently plunging into a dark transitional period where the rules of civilizational order are being violently reset. During this chaotic phase, oil prices will fluctuate wildly, inflation will defy prediction, and interest rates will repeatedly punish the working class. Our stability is merely a memory. The most terrifying danger does not lie in making the wrong financial decision. The ultimate risk resides in being passively swept into this historical vortex without ever realizing that the fundamental rules of the world have permanently altered. We cannot protect our wallets or our minds if we continue to sleepwalk through the collapse of the very systems that feed us. This narrative is not simply about a 30-kilometer waterway or the pricing mechanism of crude oil. It is a profound philosophical lesson highlighting human hubris. We arrogantly assumed we had mastered the earth, weaving an intricate web of indestructible supply chains. Yet the absolute silence of this strait shatters that grand illusion, proving that geography still holds the ultimate veto over human destiny. We are entering an uncharted epoch where the old maps of power have burned away. I hope this immersive journey has upgraded your cognitive understanding of the invisible forces shaping our reality. If you found deep value in this exploration, please remember to like this video, share your philosophical insights in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more immersive socio-economic narratives. As the geopolitical dust slowly settles over the sun-scorched waves of the Middle East, humanity is left staring directly into the abyss of a terrifyingly uncertain future. The deafening silence of that narrow waterway continues to echo through our collective consciousness. If the intricate system that powers the entire world can be brought to its knees by closing a single narrow strait, then what exactly are we trusting? Chapter Reflection. The ultimate tragedy of modernity is that we placed our absolute faith in a system destined to fracture